newspapermen meet such interesting people. They know the lowdown, now it can be told. I'll tell you quite reliably off the record about some charming people I have known.
And welcome to another edition of the Media Project here from Northeast Public Radio. This is our weekly review of what's gone on in the media, and somehow we're going to try to make some sense out of it. What doesn't make any sense is that we're recording this last year, and it's going to air next year, but it's really this year, so we'll straighten that out, and if it doesn't, it'll give you distraction in the meantime.
Whatever.
Who am I? I'm Ira Fusfeld, the retired publisher of the Daily Freeman of Kingston, New York, sitting in for Rex Smith. I'm joined by Alan Chartock, CEO of Northeast Public Radio, by Judy Patrick, longtime former editor of the Daily Gazette of Schenectady, New York, and now a vice president of the New York Press Association. And Ian Pickus is here. Ian is the news director at WAMC, and he has just celebrated his 13th anniversary with the station.
Hey.
And I'm not sure if there's a bar mitzvah joke in there, but today he is a senior member of the staff.
Ira, thanks for following me on Twitter. And as I said elsewhere, both my anniversary here at AMC and the bar mitzvah were both 1998 Yankees themed.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to just warn Alan and Judy, just in case Ian and I start talking about the Yankees, that could take up the whole half hour. So cut us off immediately. I'm going to try hard not to do that. Anyway, let's get on to the serious business of the news, and there's one that's particularly serious. I want to see if the group agrees with me at how serious it is, and this is an order by a state Supreme Court judge in New York that prevented the New York Times from running a story about an operation called Project Veritas, which many of you know is a far-right activist group and does stuff like undercover and trying to sneak up on people and discrediting media and liberal politicians. The judge said, no, the New York Times can't print that stuff, and moreover, it has to give back any documents that it has obtained from Veritas. Subsequently, an appeals court has temporarily lifted that order, at least partially so, saying the Times can keep the material for the time being, but it's still preventing it from running any stories. Boy, this is a major ruling, I think. Guys, what do you think about that, Alan?
Well, you are right about one thing. I have never read.
All?
Well, yeah, it is actually. But I have never read so much self-promotion as the Times has been doing about this. After all, this is very dangerous the way they see this. And it sets a bad precedent for them that there can be limits on, pre-publication, all the rest of it. And that has been hard fought for years and years. So the Times has been running quite a few stories and a full editorial on the subject. So they must really think this is a very tough road to hoe here.
And to Judy and Ian, it sounds like Alan is limiting the measure of concern to the New York Times having concerns. Do you guys, as broadcaster and a print person, share that view? That's just the New York Times that should be concerned?
I think what the New York Times does often sets the tone for the rest of our industry. And as Alan says, the Supreme Court has held for half a century that there cannot be prior restraint on speech when it comes to reporting. For me, it's just a very ironic situation given Project Veritas and its long history of duplicity and how it publishes its own stories. I would hope that in the long run, the Times is able to go ahead and publish what it has.
Judy, it's not just the New York Times that should be concerned. The WAMC should be concerned, and so should all of the print and digital operations that you represent at the Press Association, no?
Oh, certainly. It strikes at the heart of the First Amendment, because this whole concept of prior restraint, newspapers, any journalism should not, no judge should be able to tell you ahead of time what you can and cannot publish. It's essentially censorship. The idea that you could go in and tell the small town paper, the local radio station, you cannot broadcast, you cannot publish. That's a basic protection of the First Amendment. Judges, government cannot tell us we cannot do one thing or another. That's what was so stunning, surprising, alarming, outrageous about this court decision. The other aspect of it that was clearly wrong was the judge was ordering the New York Times to destroy documents they had collected in support of their story, arguing that it was attorney-client privilege that was the Times didn't have the right to publish. Well, that's crazy. That's not how things work. Now, at this point, the Appellate Division of State Supreme Court has put a stay on this, that the New York Times does not have to destroy the information they have for their story. It's going to come up again in early January. So this has not been decided at all. Most people agree that it was just a wrong-headed decision by this local judge, and everyone is hoping that it gets turned around. But let's not forget the fact that at the highest levels of the judicial system, at the U.S. Supreme Court, some of the judges there have already indicated that they think some of the press freedoms are too broad, and I think 2022 could be a very dangerous year for journalists.
Alan, in addition to being surprised, Judy being surprised that this verdict came down as it did originally, I was surprised because it was a state Supreme Court judge in New York. You have a theory about where did they find a judge in New York that would actually uphold this?
Ira, you put your finger right on it. First of all, there is something we all know about. Lawyers know about it, and that is something called judge shopping. You bring a case where you know you've got a sympathetic judge, but, there is a lot of resentment out there about the way that newspapers have and radio stations and others have done their jobs. They're entitled to a certain amount of protection that has been established, as Judy well points out, over the years. And who knows whether the New York Times didn't take that judge's announcement of his son's impending nuptials. And I'm being funny about that, of course, or trying to be, which is that people have long histories, as you know, Ira, and Judy knows. People have long histories and resentments about papers. So you can say, well, it's judicial, it's legal. This is based on legal theory. Or you can say that judge was one PO'd guy about something that happened maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and here was an I'll show him. We've all put up with that. We've met somebody who talks to you and says, oh, you're from the Schenectady paper? Well, I remember when they did this or did that, or you're from WAMC. And there's a whole bunch of background. Now, we can talk as a journalistic panel all we want about the concept of is this good or is this bad, but I'm just simply saying there are a lot of things out there that are ancillary to decisions that are made by judges.
It's hard to believe that a judge would fall into the category that you describe, but you're right. We've all experienced people having anger at our own institutions because of non-related matters, such as, I used to give speeches saying, why do people hate their local newspaper? Well, they may have misspelled a name in an obituary. They may not have run their kid's picture at the class play. They may not have picked them for the all-star team in baseball. And those little things combine and create a dislike, irrationally so, in my opinion. But, I didn't think it would reach the level of a state Supreme Court judge. Judy, you said that the court, the next stage is a couple of weeks from now?
Correct. It's mid-January.
Yeah.
They're back in court, and we'll see where this eventually lands. I can imagine that this decision, if it's upheld, could eventually make its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Lord knows what will happen there.
Well, that's a good segue to what's going on in the world in general, or in this country in general, about the partisan divide, the silos, the sharp division that we have in this country. And as it relates to the media, and I'm looking at a story by a critic in the L.A. Times by the name of Lorraine Ali, the headline of which is "The Crisis of Democracy is a Media Crisis and the Mainstream Press is Losing." And she's making the point of a number of the tactics that are being used by right-wing outlets such as Tucker Carlson's and Fox News, while at the same time the more traditional broadcast outlets are still playing by the rules that have been established over decades. and she calls it both sides journalism, which suggests that people like Chuck Todd on Meet the Press, or Chris Wallace when he was on Fox, or David Muir of ABC, feel the need to have the other side when the other side objectively is off the rails, and all you're doing by using the other side is giving them oxygen. I think there are numerous other examples of this. I'm curious to see what you guys think. Ian? How do you work it at WAMC in the newsroom? Are you interviewing using both-sidism?
Well, we do try to give everybody a chance, and I think Alan taught me early on in this job that we have a pretty smart audience here, and if somebody says something objectionable, untrue, yeah, you call it out, and you try to make sure that the truth is being aired, but you also have to trust to a certain degree that the audience is going to be smart enough to make their own opinion about what they're hearing. So, for many years on shows like The Congressional Corner and others, people who are, running for office or in office have had their fair shot at the airwaves, and we want to give them the platform so that the people listening can make up their own minds. I think things have changed, and I noticed it in my job after the 2016 election. A lot of times before, people in our audience would maybe complain about a certain commentator or politician appearing, but after that it became, why are you giving this person any airtime at all? They're part of the fascist movement to end America. So the tenor of the audience has certainly changed, although I think what we do is basically where it was, although I will say, we've talked about this before on the show, some of the far-right Trump supporters in Congress have stopped making media appearances on places like WAMC.
Well, that's true, Ian. I can think particularly of a congresswoman from the North Country, Elise Stefanik, who won't come anywhere near these microphones, even though we treat everybody extremely fairly when we are interviewing them and when we're with them. But Ira, Judy, Ian, we have had a debate for years about what we call other-sidism, which is, at what point do you give honor to the other side by giving them time, either in the newspaper or on the air? Now, we like to think we do that here because we think it's the right thing. When we're talking about other-sidism, and we often come to this point, was there another side to the Holocaust? So, sure, there are Holocaust deniers out there, Ira. On the other hand, we know that millions and millions and millions of people died at the hands of the Nazis. So do you honor it by some people coming up from Connecticut and saying, there was no Holocaust and giving their side of it? It's a very difficult decision to make because I know how I feel about that.
Let's say, for the sake of discussion, that Elise Stefanik, the aforementioned congresswoman who is not showing up on your air by her choice, that she agreed to come on, and you did an interview with her, and she made a statement, a Trump-like statement. Would you advocate that Ian's team in the newsroom call her up on it and say, wait a minute, that's not true? Is that the reporter's job, even in this day and age, or is it to let them go ahead unchallenged?
No, they have to be challenged when they say something that's incorrect, and we would do that. On the other hand, I do think everybody who gets interviewed at this radio station is treated extremely respectfully. Ian?
I would just direct anyone who's interested to listen to our last one-on-one interview with her, which was conducted by North Country Bureau Chief Pat Bradley just before the January 6th vote about a year ago, when Congresswoman Stefanik announced that she would vote against certification of President Biden's victory. Pat was extraordinarily respectful and measured, but she did challenge Congresswoman Stefanik with historical facts and pushed her to explain her position. And, that's the last time we talked to her. I think WAMC comes out looking fine in the wash.
Judy, what about it from the print digital side?
Well, one of the concerns, especially now, is that both sides' approach has enabled right-wing fanatics to appear normal. I actually remember getting caught up in the both-sidism issue back when we started to cover climate change, because we would listen to people who would argue, no, there's no, the climate isn't changing, and we would try to balance our stories. In retrospect, we probably should have taken a harder analysis of both sides and not given as much attention to people who were denying climate change back in the day. So it's always been an issue we've dealt with. But I agree that I think the press bends over backward way too often to try to give credence to some of these far extremist viewpoints, and rather than calling it out. We see this with Joe Manchin with the coverage of his opposition to the Build Back Better legislation. The press is trying so hard to call out Democrats that they're really not examining, how obstinate and obstructionist the Republicans have been, and I think it's a reaction to pressure they're getting from people, from readers, from listeners, from viewers who are arguing that we're not covering the right wing far enough. We even got a little bit of this when the Tea Party was around. The Tea Party advocates would call up and would challenge us, and I agree that we need to include conservative, right-wing viewpoints in our journalism, but when it gets to the point of lying, when it gets to the point where things are not true, I think that's when we have to set the line and say, no, we're not going to do that, and we need to call it out.
Well, just as a final note on this subject, from the critic Lorraine Ali from the LA Times, she says the careful, equitable reporting of PBS NewsHour and NPR remains a valuable public service. But in this age of extremes, the point-counterpoint structure is sorely out of step with the bombast of politicians like Congresswoman Green and the fact-bending screed of hangers-on like Rudy Giuliani. I think we're going to be talking a lot more of this as we go forward. This is the Media Project from Northeast Public Radio. I'm Ira Fusfeld with Alan Chartock, Ian Pickus, and Judy Patrick. I sent around a story to the group, and they probably were wondering why we would be interested in it, but something about it sparked a note for me. And this was a feature in the Washington Post about a TV journalist by the name of Wendy Rieger, who had been a anchor on the news in Washington for decades. All of the markets have somebody like Wendy Rieger who comes into your homes every night of the week. I think in the Capital District of the late Ed Daig or the still active Liz Bishop. New York City, you have Chuck Scarborough and Sue Simmons. And so she's been around. And she's just retired now after 33 years. But she told a story that sparked a note for me. She said early in her career, she covered a vigil by the family and friends of two men whose plane had gone missing. The group camped at a municipal airport for several days, and Rieger got to know them during her daily live updates from the scene. One day, just before airtime, a search team reported that it had found these planes' wreckage, and there were no survivors. As she went on the air, Rieger was close enough to hear the gasps and anguished cries from the families. Rieger reported the grim news, and then just before signing off, she lost it, breaking into sobs on live television. And she was, of course, mortified is the word that was used, and feared that it would hurt her career. I'm wondering whether you guys, particularly the broadcast people, feel that it's appropriate for a reporter to react that way, or should we not be the steely-eyed, nothing bothers us reporters, and let the readers and listeners and viewers decide what their own reactions are going to be?
Well, Ira, you're the moderator here, and you're a good moderator. So my question to you is, you don't get away with just moderating. You got to give an opinion too. What do you think?
My opinion is, as the Billy Martin used to say in the beer commercials, I feel strongly both ways. I think that a story such as the one I just described, it's hard for a reporter not to be touched by it and to emote over it. That said, I'm an old-fashioned guy. All I want to hear is the reporter giving the report. In the movie Broadcast News, when you might remember the William Hurt character ends a news bulletin special by saying, I think we're going to be all right, and the director says, who cares what you think? So that's my opinion. What's yours?
If I could, I think where things are going in this space is In the world of podcasts, there are slightly different rules, and a lot of good journalism is being done there. And you'll hear a lot more of what you talked about in that article, Ira, with true crime podcasts, first-person journalism, where the reporter becomes a character in the story. And I think that's the vanguard of how audio storytelling, at least, is looking these days. And what you've described will become the rule and not the exception for a lot of serious and not so serious journalism that's being done. I mean, not everything's so dramatic as this particular story, but in the long run, I think you'll hear a lot less of the old school kind of Cronkite approach and a lot more of the here's what I saw and here's how it affected me sort of storytelling.
Well, I don't know, Ian. Ira comes from another time. Earlier, I don't mean to be disrespectful.
Another time, another place. I'm an alien.
In any way, but you come from an earlier time when there were a set of rules that we don't adhere to anymore. I have to admit, I've cried on the air when during a fund drive and I'm telling a story or something like that happens. And we can argue whether or not I'm an official newscaster or not. But, I do think that people have come to respect the idea that people can have passions and reporters can have passions, and that's important too. You got a young reporter who is doesn't know the old rules and is interviewing somebody who's plainly a racist and calls him on it or her on it. My own feeling about this is we're evolving into a place where we can, and fortunately can, give opinions. Walter Cronkite, as you mentioned, said, he was largely responsible, many people think, for ending the Vietnam War because he gave his opinions. So I am not one who feels that we have strayed. Rather, I think we're going forward.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Cronkite because he's the only example that I could think of on a national level, big-time broadcaster who almost lost it. And that, of course, is during that famous time when Kennedy was assassinated. And we've all seen the newsreel clips of him announcing the death and then taking a deep breath, looking like he was about to cry and then catching himself. But I can't remember any other time that I've noticed that in broadcast journalism. Judy, what about print? I mean, obviously we don't see what the reporters look like while they're sitting over their computer screens, but how involved do you want your reporters to be with a story?
I think Ian's right when it comes to podcasts, and you're getting a different kind of involvement by the reporter with the interview subject. And, print reporters, and, it's merging print, digital, audio. It's all merging into one at this point. And print reporters have the luxury. Their reaction isn't going to show up in print. They can get involved when they're interviewing someone, but that tends to happen, I must say, with younger reporters. As older reporters have seen so much, and, they kind of get hardened. I'll have to be blunt about it, and they will see a lot of bad things in the course of a career, and they just get tough, and they often don't let down their guards. But I've seen even veteran reporters come back from a horrific fire or an accident, and they will be traumatized. And in fact, we have our industry works hard to help reporters deal with trauma when they encounter it. We don't have to deal with war, but there are legions of reporters out there that have to see war, have to see school shootings. This is horrific stuff, and where reporters are human. The goal, however, is for them to put those emotions aside and so they can objectively report. But I agree with Ian. The podcasts bring another dimension to reporting, and I welcome that.
I used to find that in the newsrooms that I hung out in that there was a gallows humor, that there was there might be a tragedy, and before long there were jokes being made in the newsroom, and on the one hand it's unseemly, and on the other hand I think it was sort of a defense mechanism so that you'd laugh so that you wouldn't be crying.
I was actually standing in a television newsroom at one point when the assignment editor said big crash on the thruway, and one of the reporters yelled out, "Anybody dead?" And the guy said no, and the reporter used an expletive.
We used to get a bulletin that would come in and say 300 people died in a plane crash in Japan, and the first question we had, anybody local? That was the question, not 300 people died. Well, okay, so that is that, and we are running out of time, but I wanted to at least touch on a subject we've talked about frequently, and that is the dissolving of newspapers and who or what are filling in the void. And according to a report in Axios, independent digital outlets and nonprofits have begun to fill some of the gap left by fading local newspapers. And it speaks to a number of new online publishers that have come up, and et cetera, and all of whom appear to be nonprofit. But there still remains a question as to whether or not they can, even in the nonprofit mode, pay for the people that they have, and that the number of people they have is often fewer than the depleted newspapers that they're trying to replace. All of which is to say this is still an evolving situation, but there is going to be, and there is already becoming, a tipping point, and it's expressed by a man named Stephen Waldman, who is the co-founder of Report for America, a local journalism nonprofit, who says the decline of local newspapers has not just led to more government corruption and waste, but also polarization and misinformation. What say you?
Well, the more information you have, the more intelligent you could be about making up your mind about things, and readers should be put into that category. On the other hand, it's just one more sign of, the general death of newspapers. I know this isn't something that goes over well on this panel, with many of you having, done your thing that way, but they do seem, as one newspaper publisher I knew once said to me about something else, stick a fork in it.
Well, I know Judy and Ian are not going to believe this, but Alan's going to have to get the last word because we're running low on time, and so I'm going to halt it right here and tell you that this has been the Media Project. Thank you very much for listening. Happy New Year. I'm Ira Fusfeld. For Alan Chartock, Ian Pickus, and Judy Patrick, please join us again next week for another edition of the Media Project.
For I meet politicians and grafters by the score, killers plain and fancy, it's really quite a bore. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people. They wallow in corruption, crime, and gore. Ting-a-ling-ling, city desk, full the press, extra, extra, read all about it, it's a mess, meets the test. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people. It's wonderful to represent the press.
The Media Project is a production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. Alan Chartock is CEO of WAMC, Professor Emeritus at the State University of New York, commentator, columnist, and author. Judy Patrick is the Vice President for Editorial Development for the New York Press Association. Ian Pickus is WAMC's News Director. And Ira Fusfeld is the Publisher Emeritus of the Daily Freeman. You can find out more or schedule a podcast at WAMC.org or just download the free WAMC app from the Play Store for your iPhone or Android and listen to the Media Project anytime, anywhere. Thanks for listening.